All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Alex Spira. I've been a Virginia cancer specialist now for the better part of 2 decades. Dr. Gandhi and myself co-run the VCS Research Institute. I'm mainly a lung cancer doctor and do a lot of phase 1 studies. Mithil?
Hi, everyone. I've been at VCS for about 11 years. I focus a lot on malignant hematology, so leukemia, lymphoma, myeloma. And happy to present sort of our clinical trial footprint.
Yeah, I think today we'll talk a lot about what we do and why we do it and why it's so important. So our team has grown through the years. Years ago, it started actually with Nick Robert, which very few people probably remember at VCS, but he's a world-renowned breast cancer doctor. Our team is very highly experienced and dedicated. We have about 200 actively accruing trials of various states, going from phase 1 to phase 3. Our program has about 70 or so, give or take, wonderful employees that work really hard, and we're grateful to have them and continuously tries to grow. We're part of the U.S. Oncology Research Network, now Sarah Cannon, and since 1999, which Nick Robert again was one of the founders, we've had about 80,000 people enroll on trials of over 1,600 clinical trials through the U.S. Oncology Research Network. Our program itself has put on about 3,400 patients over studies. Clearly, the majority are breast, brain, lung, and blood cancers, among others. Over the last couple of years, we've had several hundred patients enroll, and we actually now work with Next Oncology Virginia, which is a sister program to VCS as well. And you have a nice diagram here on the right, which, we have trials for almost every tumor type. Of course, not everyone can enroll, and there are certain exceptions, but we have trials for almost every patient that walks in the door. Mithil, thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the, Alex said it best, overarching goals for the program, which we tell our colleagues, physician colleagues, or APPs that also see our patient, but everyone else, we try to have a trial for every patient. This sort of epitomizes that.
Well, one of the thoughts is that, and we'll get into this as well, is, why do we do clinical studies and why it's so important, but we'll get to that in a few minutes, I'm sure. Next slide. So we actually have, as you can see, and I love this slide here, we have trials at all of our locations. Fairfax is our main location just because that's where our pharmacy is and where things started. But we've really tried to broaden our catchment area over the last few years. Gainesville, now Bristow, I'll let Mithil comment on that, has been always a very important site. Arlington as well. We've grown to Reston and really tried to make that a new focus with the growth due to the doctors there. And summer 2025, maybe a little soon, but we hope to really bring back Woodbridge, which has really been a site of growth over the last couple of years. Do you want to talk a little bit about Gainesville/Bristow?
Yeah, so I think what happened, I started in Gainesville. Utah was there as our CRC, and now we've expanded to 3 or 4 and continue to grow. And like Alex mentioned, expanding out to the Woodbridge office as well. And sort of crystallizes that, if there is attention and sort of desire to put people on study, the program sort of can organically grow. And it's not growth for the sake of it. It sort of allows and democratizes access to clinical trials. So, we talk about whether it's in Bristow, Woodbridge, Arlington, and now Reston as well. It's to get trials to patients as opposed to the other way around, patients to trials. So we want to make sure that we have accessibility. Some of them, when we're at these offices saying, oh, well, you may need to go to Fairfax, it's just because of some of the logistical issues of investigational drugs. And so it's not as though we wouldn't want trials in these sites, it's just sometimes we can't operationalize them. So we try to do as much as we can close to where patients are, and then some of them has to be centralized in Fairfax.
Yeah, and I know that's obviously not ideal for some patients, especially older who don't like to travel. Unfortunately, there are certain things that I didn't even know existed before doing this job. Drug transport, drug stability. Some of these things require longer hours. It just makes it harder to do those. But we really try where at all possible for our doctors and our patients to have our patients stay in their home office. Next slide. So, as I said, we have VCS and we have Next. We have between the two programs, we have about 150 team members right now. And suffice to say, we have between the two of us, we have, I think, the largest and most comprehensive oncology program now in the Mid-Atlantic. We routinely get patients referred in for many, many studies right now, and it's great because our goal is to number one and number two is really our own in-house patients because that's who we serve, but also the surrounding area. And we get patients from throughout the Mid-Atlantic and actually throughout the country now that come in for studies. 2024, we partner with Sarah Cannon. We have two programs internally, an internal and one that's jointly done with U.S. Oncology Research. That's now Sarah Cannon. So we partner with them as well to bring a lot of patients in, and the focus is on advancing therapies over the last decades and what we do. And Sarah Cannon is clearly a powerhouse organization, and we work with them very so much as well to bring in more options for our patients. Anything you'd like to add, Ethel?
Yeah, no, I think you said it best. It's a really comprehensive program. The scale probably, unless you're in it, it's hard to fathom, even if you're in a large scale academic program, how much bigger sort of our research program is in comparison. Not that that's again a goal, but it's just sort of so it shows a breadth of options.
Yep. All right. Next slide. And here's some of them. I mean, the list is huge. This is, Sarah Cannon slash VCS. We've had a lot of drugs, and kind of the goal is to make better treatments for our patients. And you can see here the list of many of these drugs that we partook in the clinical studies for. And I think of this as two things. One, the idea is it's great to be part of advancing it for the next patients, which is clearly what the future is. But, a lot of these drugs are patients were able to get on study that they were not able to get in any other way. So we're able to bring, it's kind of corny, but tomorrow's treatments today. So by enrolling in some of these clinical studies, patients get the most advanced therapy for their malignancy. Next slide. We have two clinical trial navigators. We started this a couple of years ago. Now there's a team, and there's actually a couple of people under them, but most of you know Carrie Friedman, who I've known now for as long as I've been at VCS. She was a nurse in the hospital a long time ago, and Maury, not quite as long, but nearly as long. They're a clinical trial nurse navigator team, and I think they do two things. One is they work with the doctors to educate them on all the trials that we have. It's hard. We have so many clinical studies. And two is they're kind of the first conduit for patients as they may call in. So they take a lot of calls and questions from patients as to, are they eligible for study? Can they be enrolled on a clinical study? And that's what they're really involved in as well. They also do a lot of education and work with the doctors. We were actually the first site in U.S. Oncology to really establish these roles, and it's grown. Now have a couple people under them, and we're probably going to get a junior person as well, and probably a third given the volume that they see. I think on an average, they see 200 referrals a month. Of course, not all of them result in a clinical trial enrollment by any stretch, but they take a lot of questions and phone calls right now, really trying to drill it down. And even before patients come in, they work with the patients as well. Mithil, how do you think this program has worked for yourself personally as well as the patients?
So the advantage of having Carrie and Maury, you learn even more when you talk to other sites where they're present. There's not an equivalent version of them. And it personifies their importance in our practice. So it can't be overstated. Physicians have the luxury of being able to email Maury or Carrie saying, "Hey, we've got a patient. Do we have a trial?" And all of a sudden it goes into this magic black box, and then somehow at the end of it, they're seeing one of us with a potential study on hand. And that comes through a lot of experience, familiarity, through sort of constant review of our trial portfolio and making sure there is very efficient throughput. And now a lot of external referrals, they just immediately know to contact Carrie or Maury, and these people get seen. This doesn't exist in other programs, and now other programs are looking at ours and seeing, wow, this is such a huge benefit, and they're trying to sort of imprint and remodel their own sort of trial navigator off of what Carrie has created here.
Yeah, great. Next slide. So what are clinical studies? So in general, they are research studies using patient volunteers to look at new therapies. So the use of either experimental or off-label drugs or new formulations to try and improve outcomes. It could be for adjuvant, improving the goals after therapy, better therapies right now. So you're comparing A and B. I use the example of first-line lung cancer. We have A, but if you add B to the first-line lung cancer treatment, do patients do better? And of course, there's a whole pile of clinical trials mainly in phase one, but evolving as well for patients that don't have any other options. I wish it was easy, and we spent a lot of time doing this. There's eligibility criteria to determine if a patient is able to enroll. It'd be unrealistic to expect that we're getting perfect patients. This is cancer, right? So patients have a lot of comorbidities, etc. But there are certain criteria that has to be done, and it's why we have so many people doing this job to really look at that. Some of that we knew just by looking at a patient's chart, but there's a lot of pre-testing that goes on. Mithil, can you comment on what it takes to get somebody enrolled and why you walk in today, you can't get on a clinical study tomorrow?
Yeah, the timeline, as Alex mentioned, yeah, there's a lot to be done. So just a rough sort of outline. If someone were to email Carrie or Maury and they say, "Hey, can you evaluate this for a trial?" and Alex or myself or our other investigators see the patient, they're seen. They have to have the consent reviewed, which is a document that explains the trial, and they volunteer for the study. They need at least a day to review that, come back, ask any questions, sign consent. And then you go through the screening process, which can last up to 28 days. We try to be faster, but there's a lot of study-specific diagnostic tests they have to get done, like imaging, relevant blood work, potential biopsies. And then all of that has to be reviewed by the sponsor or the sort of entity that's operating the clinical trial to approve a patient, and then they would start. So, it is more work than saying ordering standard of care, which you might get an authorization in 48, 72 hours and be able to start. But the reason that we do the work is because we think that there is a lot of gain at the end for both the patient and the study, and hopefully get them access to a newer and better approach to treating. But it is work, so there's always a time component that we always sort of inform patients and referring docs and team members that it's going to be a couple of weeks before we actually formally get them onto the trial.
Yeah, and I know that's frustrating, and I know everybody wants it sooner. It's the way it works. I usually tell people, for the most part, most patients can wait that time. There's obviously an emotional component because everybody wants to start their oncology treatment yesterday, but it is what we have to do. So, all right, next slide. So what is informed consent? It's basically having people sign paperwork that says that they know what they're undergoing is experimental, what their standard options are, if any, and what the possible side effects are. These documents are often very long. I just had one that was 44 pages, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you that, what it's like to read a 44-page document, but they're often incredibly detailed. They're all approved by the Institutional Review Board, which means somebody goes and make sure that, and it's an independent party that goes to make sure that it makes sense, that the patients and any family members are adequately assessed, adequately understand what the risks are of the study and what's unknown about the study, because we want patients to make the best decision. And I will tell you, there's many patients after reading it, it sounds good when we meet them in person, and then we read the document and they decide they don't want to do it, and that's totally fine, right? The idea is to have everybody understand what the risks are with enrolling on an experimental clinical trial. Next slide. So what is a protocol? A protocol is a study plan. So there's a 20 to 40 page informed consent document, and we usually have a 100 to 200 page document that's called a study protocol. And this tells us what the drug is, what the mechanism of action is, how they work, why it's being done, what the criteria are, and how we perform a clinical study. These are incredibly detailed. That's why we have a team, and I kid everybody, but on average, we have 4 employees to 5 employees per patient enrolled. It's incredibly detailed in terms of what's done, and then we have to collect all that data. It's reviewed by the study sponsor, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, so they get a say, and the Institutional Review Board, and it ensures that we follow the clinical trial protocol to the best of our ability. Of course, no one's perfect, including patients, and this has to be followed to the letter of the law. And there should not be any deviations. Of course, there are mistakes that happen. Of course, there are things that happen due to patients having cancer, but to the best of our ability, we have to follow this clinical trial protocol. We have to adjust the doses accordingly. And what makes it so complicated, Thoughts? I talked a little bit about informed consent and the protocols. Myrtle, do you want to comment on some of this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think you covered it well. It's a lot of work with a lot of attention and detail to make sure that we're doing everything right. And this may come up later. The main priority, obviously, we want the patient to do well, is really safety. So the reason all of this is involved, and it can seem onerous and granular, is the last thing we want to do is put anyone in harm's way.
And here are the kinds of clinical studies. So phase one is where you're testing it for the first time, and it's doing two things. It's looking for efficacy, but the main endpoint is uh, how is the drug given and what the side effects are. So that's where we really focus. Phase two is interesting because you basically take phase one and you just expand it. So you figure out the dose and you do a big phase two study to look at that. Phase three is where you're really trying to confirm what you've gotten in phase one and two, where you're looking at two different doses or you're looking at standard of care plus. The classic example is we have a standard of care in lung cancer. You identified a drug that may have efficacy in phase one and phase two, and now you're adding it on to the standard of care or comparing it in phase three. I'll give you one example of a drug that we have in right now in phase three. It's shown a lot of promise in phase one and phase two. It's a drug that targets KRAS. And the phase three is comparing it after standard therapy, so what we call second line versus chemotherapy. So the trials, half the patients get the study drug and half get standard of care therapy. We don't do many, if any, phase four. That's really looking at some subtle endpoints. So we're really focusing on phase one through three. But it's interesting because over the last couple of years, phase two has really disappeared, and there's been a big focus on phase one and expansion. So you do a phase one where you're looking and figuring out the doses, and then they expand either in early phase one or it's called a phase 1B, and you're really looking at efficacy, and then you're making a decision about whether or not it needs to go to phase three. This is done for lots of reasons. The most important reason is that it saves time. You're not testing tons of patients, and you can really answer the same questions with the caveat that these phase 1B studies really are a little bit more complicated than a phase two because we still have a lot of measurements and endpoints that take a lot of time up, but it's a little bit more efficient for this clinical trial development. We still do some, absolutely, but things have changed overall. Next slide. Mithil, why don't you talk to the, little about this? Why patients participate in a clinical study? I could talk about it, but I'd be curious to see how you approach it from a patient standpoint.
So anytime I see a consult for a trial and we start getting into the nuances of the study, and invariably you'll have a patient ask a doc, why should I do this? And the answer that I have is sort of simple. So I think there's two main reasons we do a clinical trial. The selfish reason for a patient is that they get potentially access to what we believe is a newer and better approach to treating their cancer. Whether it's early on in their disease or later on in their disease, whenever it is, we just think fundamentally that approach is better. And now they have access to an approach that is not yet approved and may be better than the existing standard of care. So that's the sort of selfish reason. And then the humanistic reason is this is the sort of link of cancer care. Any standard of care drug that we give is because patients prior, many, many years ago, participated in those clinical trials that allowed approval of those drugs. And I think when, at least for me, when I frame it like that, I think it deeply resonates with patients, both for their own health and then sort of their awareness that they are in this sort of link of patients who've participated in these studies to get access so that others can get access to newer and better drugs. I'm very sort of um, precise about my language around it. I think that we're careful about using words about experimental or these sort of things. They are experimental agents, but they may not be. They may be approved drugs being used in different ways. And we emphasize that, you're not being experimented upon, or you're not a guinea pig, which is sort of a verbiage we get tossed around. It's really to help the person in front of us, and then ideally help the field and other patients in the future. And that's how I sort of always frame when we talk about trials.
No, I think that was great. And, there's lots of reasons why patients should. At the end of the day, I always tell people it's their decision. We often have good standard of care options as well. Next slide. So what are the risks? So number one, I always tell people it's always more time. A clinical study is never quite the same. It always involves something. Even patients that I give the example of getting randomized to two arms, you either get the experimental arm or the standard arm in a phase 3 study. We are a little bit more tighter on the experimental arm because we have to be. The time points have to be defined. There's certain things that have to be followed. You don't get to choose, right? I use the analogy, when patients enroll in a clinical study, they're doing because they want the new fancier drug, either with the standard of care or in lieu of, but we don't get that choice. That is always decided, and that can be very hard for patients to understand. I just had a patient that was referred for a different clinical study, but at his previous site, he didn't want to do the randomized study because he's a control guy and he did not want to lose control of somebody telling him what to do. Health insurance and managed care providers may not cover all the costs. The good news is for the most part, clinical trial costs are often covered by the clinical study, so it makes it a little bit easier. There are some standard of care costs. Patients still may have the costs associated with imaging or even the standard of care drugs, so it's not all free. We look into that, and we have a team dedicated to figuring out that patients. So in general, it's less, but we don't know that for sure, and we have a team looking into that. If we knew a clinical trial worked, it wouldn't be in clinical studies. You may do all this for naught. It may not be better than standard of care, but you can at least say you tried and got something. And of course, there are unknown side effects. And what I tell patients is those pieces of paper that you throw away when you get a pill, it's called the product insert. That all comes from the clinical study. We spend a lot of time trying to get that information from the clinical study, and there are unknown side effects. Sometimes clinical trials are only given to what we've had many patients where they're the first person, the first 20 people, and we're learning about all the side effects. So there's a big unknown there. We never want untoward side effects, but that is a risk as well. We have a team of dedicated professionals, physicians, nurses, clinical research coordinators, monitoring patients exceedingly closely. Sometimes patients will tell us too much. But at the end of the day, these are risks associated. Most of our patients are not turned off by this, but some are, and that's important, and it's why we have these consent forms. Anything you'd like to add, Middle?
No, the only other thing, it's rare, but we do want to make sure that there is sort of awareness on the patient and family's part, what's involved, because it does, require sort of that first word is important, informed consent. You need to know what you're doing and having the side effects. So in the rare instances, we sort of quibble about whether or not a patient is a trial candidate. It has to be also in the context of their ability to process, understand everything, awareness of side effects, and then being able to relay that to us as well.
Yeah. Next slide. So what are the myths? So they are not just reserved for only late stage cancers. We have many for early stage cancers, and this is incredibly important to understand. We think about it for all patients at all stages, and many of our therapies in the adjuvant setting are taking drugs that are discovered for the advanced and bringing them to earlier line. So one very important myth. Next slide. Patients are treated like guinea pigs and will likely only receive a placebo. Some of our studies do involve placebos. We don't intend to have people treated like guinea pigs, for sure. We do our best to treat patients with the utmost dignity, both as standard of care and uh, clinical trials. Placebos are used in some clinical studies. There's no way about it. Patients do understand that. I actually try and avoid getting those clinical studies because nobody wants them, but we do have them. For the most part, sometimes the placebo-controlled studies are standard of care plus. So again, these are myths. We do our best to treat everybody like a individualized person to the best of our ability. Next slide. Patients can always withdraw. So if you decide you can withdraw from day one to whenever you would like, you're 100% given that right, and no doctor in our practice or in our group would ever tell you anything other than that. It is fully voluntary, and patients can withdraw whenever they like, and it will not affect their further care. I'll have you comment on some of these aftermaths as we kind of go through them. Next slide. They're only offered at hospitals or academic institutions. We have more trials than anybody around, and we're very proud of that. We have the largest portfolio here. We have treated many, many patients, and we actually do it in, I think, a very friendly environment without the challenges of doing it in a academic center, where many of us are academic doctors and we think of ourselves that way. We have clinical trials that many of our academic centers don't have. We actually get more patients referred in than we send out multiple fold. Next slide. Any comments there, Mithla? Anything you'd like to add about those myths?
Yeah, no, I think that covers everything.
Okay.
Yeah.
Insurance companies are often required to cover standard costs. There are standard costs, and insurance companies do cover it. They almost always cover extra testing costs, as they should. There may be extra doctor visits because we're looking at secondary endpoints for safety as well. We watch for side effects. They can add costs, but in general, they are actually covered by insurance companies, or the clinical trial people are actually paying for it itself, and it's very important. And we review that at length with our team as well. So it's important things to keep in mind. Next slide. How are rights protected? So there are many of these studies have steering committees that review this commonly. There are groups that review the studies before they start. Of course, the IRB and the FDA review them to make sure we meet both scientific and ethical principles. These IRBs are completely independent of us, and they oversee us to make sure we're not just, we're doing clinical studies appropriately, but following the letter of the law. Of course, mistakes are happening, and we always try and improve that as well. And their goal is to review the health, safety, and welfare of patients to make sure everything's done fairly, and participants are well informed as to doing this. There's a huge amount of oversight into this. Next slide. How do you participate? We have a lot of people here. Our coordinators here are clearly involved. Our nurse navigators are always talking about it. It's on our website. We have a team. We try and do the best we can to inform everybody in Virginia Cancer Specialists of all the clinical studies that we have. It's rare, but if there's a clinical study that's done outside, we send patients there as well, because we believe it's part of the best care for our patients. Any thoughts, Mithil?
No, I think, there was this longstanding mantra, and I don't think it's repeated often enough, but clinical trial is probably the best version of therapy, if you can get onto one. And so ideally we'll have one, but if there's a groundbreaking study elsewhere, like Alex said, we usually know about it, and we can get people there as well.
Yeah, and if you look at NCCN guidelines, which is the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, which are guidelines trying to standardize much of what we do, first and foremost, that every tumor type is enroll in a clinical study because it's believed that you're getting the best care that you can. Next slide. Just want to thank everybody. I've talked a lot. Mithil, I'll let you have all the parting messages to our group watching this.
I think like anything else at VCS we do, there's a sort of huge backroom apparatus that makes things work smoothly and efficiently. And physicians, for better or worse, are the face of that. But it would be sort of the main myth there is that we're doing anything or everything on our own. We've got quite literally an army of CRCs, who are clinical research coordinators, data coordinators, regulatory team, so many people that patients never see that are actively engaged in making these pretty dramatic, really life-changing therapies available. So, while you may hear Alex or I or Dr. Salkini, Dr. Balani talk about trials, there's a whole village behind, and it's that effort, and I think a lot of the people in the research program take it to heart, of doing their job to provide this sort of level of care and get these people onto transformative therapy. Alex and I both have stories of patients who are either really, really sick, late line therapy, no other options. And, they get on these sort of magical drugs, and all of a sudden, not just their life is extended, but their humanity is restored. And it's a pretty moving thing to see. So keep thinking of it. And if there's anything we can ever do to lower the bar to get people on, just let us know.
Great. Thanks everybody for listening. Really appreciate it, and reach out to any member of the team or us if you have any questions.